We'll start in 1 minute, everybody. We'll start in 1 minute. So it is Tisha B'Av evening. It's Zach Gomo here, representing, I think, both Bialik College and Chabad of Dingley Village in some ways. And I'm here with Rabbi Mendel Heller, the rabbi of Chabad Dingley. And first of all, I have to say thank you so much to the Hellers and the Chabad Dingley for hosting this joint event with Bialik College. We were hoping it would be live and on Zoom, but Hashem had other plans and we are entirely on Zoom, but it's no less meaningful. We're no less together. At 8 o'clock this evening, we will be having a presentation on the Crusades and the Jews. But before we do so, Rabbi Heller is going to read Megillat Eicha and give an explanation as to what Tisha B'Av is, what is the significance and meaning behind this evening. And we thank you all so much for joining us for this.
Okay, so thank you so much to Zach. We were lucky enough to have booked Zach months ago before anybody else can get him for tonight's event. And Bialik and Zach Gomer wanted to join as well. So we're really happy to be doing this as a joint event. We had planned a few minutes to do a quick Ma'ariv, but we're not going to do that tonight as it's no people present in person. So I wanted to just give a 2-minute introduction to Tisha B'Av, and if we have some more time, we're not going to start Zach's talk before 8 o'clock. Tisha B'Av, of course, we know is the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. Historically, Tisha B'Av's roots starts from 3,333 years ago, when the Jewish people were in the desert. And they sent spies to spy out the land of Israel to find out the best way to conquer it. And when the people came back with a negative report, all the people started crying. And God said, well, you're crying over nothing. And therefore, for all future generations, any calamity or sad thing that is going to occur to the Jewish people will end up occurring on Tisha B'Av. And we know historically that some of the most important and negative events historically have occurred on Tisha B'Av, most famously the destruction of the 2 temples. The first temple that stood for 410 years, the second temple that stood for 420 years. The first temple was built by King Solomon and destroyed by the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuzaradan, his general. And the second temple was built by Ezra and then destroyed 420 years later by the Romans under the Emperor Vespasian, and his son Titus was the king that destroyed it. Going down the road historically, many other negative events have occurred, like I believe the First World War, the Spanish Inquisition. The actual date that the Jews had to leave Spain was Tisha B'Av, and there's actually been hundreds of negative events that have occurred, unfortunately, on this day. And for some reason, God made it that everything that would happen negatively should always occur on this day. We know that just like Yom Kippur, for example, is a day of atonement because the first year that the Jewish people were actually in the desert and they were atoned for the golden calf, and the announcement of their atonement came on Yom Kippur. That became the day of atonement for all future generations. With that in mind, we are now going to start reading Megillat Eicha. In order to make it easier for you, We are going to put up on the screen the Megillah, both in Hebrew and English, so you can follow along. I will read it with the traditional tune of the Megillat Eicha.
And if you are watching on Facebook, feel free to click on the link below and you will be able to see the shared screen as well.
Okay. Eicha yashva badad ha'ir ha'basiyam ha'yesa ka'almana rasi b'amdinais ha'yesa lamas b'chais ke balayla v'limasa al lecheya ein lo menachem mikol yaveya Kol re'eh bavduva hayilal hayivim Gal sayuda meyoni u'meireiv avoda hiyashva v'agayim Loi matzah manaya kol re'eh yisigua ben hametzarim darchei tzion haveis Mibli boyei moyei Kol se'area shoymemim koyanea nenochim v'sulosenu gois v'himarga ayutare alarai ve'ashalu ki adinai haiga arai b'shorea oilolea halchu shvi lifnei tzar v'yetzei min basyoin Kol hadara hayusarei kayalim leimatzu mir'eh vayelchu v'leichoyach lifnei roidei Zachra Yerushalayim yemei oniya u'merudea koil machmudea asher hayu mimei kedem b'nefil amo v'yad tzar V'yein oizer lo, ra'u atzarim sochaku al mishpateya chet chata Yerushalayim al kei l'nida ha'yisrael kal machbedea zilua ki ra'u ar ervasa gam hinencha v'tasha b'chol tumasa b'shuleha lo yizachra achrisa V'ateiret peloim ein menachem la Re'ei adinai es ani ki gilayei Yadoi forastzor al kol machmadeo Kira asagayim po mikdasho asher tzivisa Lo yovo v'kol loch Kol amon enochim v'akshim lechem Nasenu machmadeihem ba'oichel hashiv nafesh Re'ei adinai v'abita ki hayisi zayleya Lo yalechem kol oivrei derech habitu riu im yesh machoiv kemachoivi asher oilali asher haiga adinai b'yayim charein apoy Mimaraim sholach eich pas moisai v'yirtena foras reshes l'raglai heshivani achor nisanani shoymeima kol hayom davo niskad al peshoai v'yadai Yistaragu alu al tzavarich shil koichi nesanani adinoi bidei layuchalku sila kol abirei adinoi bekirebi karalai moyei lishbar bachuroi gas dorach adinoi lipsulas pasuda al ele ani boichi Eini yordomayim ki rachak mimeni menachem meshiv nafshi hayu vanai shoymemim ki gavar oyev peresot zion beyodei ein menachem lo tziva adinoi liyakoy tzvigav tzara Hayesa Yerushalayim Lanida Beinayim Tzadiku Adonai Kifi Marisi Shimon Chal Hamim Uru Machadi V'sulai Sayu Vachurai Yolchu Vashevi Kara Asilamai Vayai Morinuni Koyenai Uzkenai Boyer Govo Ki Bikshu Oichel Amoy Vayoshibu Es Nafshom Rei Adinoi Kitali Meyai Homar Moru Nefachli Bibekibi Kimoroi Moris Ilchit Shiklo Chereva Bayis Komoves Shamu Kinenochoni Ein Menachemli Kol Oyevai Shamu Rasi Sosu Kiato Asiso Evei Sayen Karasa Veyuchamoini Tavai Cholra Sam Lefanecha Vaile Lamoy Kasher Al Tali Al Kol Peshoy Kirabois Anchoisai Velibi Davoy Eicha Yoiv Beapoy Adinoi Espasio Ishlich Mishamai Meres Tiferes Israel Vele Zachar Hadoim Raglo Veyim Apoy Bila Adinoi Veloy Chamal, Eis Kol Eis Yaakov, Haras Bevrasa, Loy Mipterei Basudai, Kia Lord, it's Chilel Mamlacha B'Soreo, Godab Choria, of Kol Keren Yisrael, Shivachor, Yemina Mipnei Ayoye, Vivar Yaakov, Keish Levach Losaviv, Torah Kashtoi, Kioye, Mitzvah Yemino, Nitzav Yeminoi, Ketzor V'Aroi, Kol Machmedei Ayim. Oyel Vasiyoy, Shofach Kovesh, Chamosoy, Hoyo Adinoi, Koyei, Bela Yisrael, Bila Kol Armonei Seo, Taniyo, Vayaniyo. Vayach Mois Kagan, Sukoy, Shiches, Moyadoy, Shikach Adinoi, Bitzion, Moyei V'Shabos. Vayinatz mizamapoy melech b'choyen zanach adinoi mitzbechoy niyem mikdoshoy hizkir biyadoyei b'choymoy sarmonoi seho koil nosnu beveis adinoi b'yoyim koyen choshav adinoi leashchis choymas pasiyoyin notokov lo yeheshiv yadoi mibala Mibalei Avayavel Chel B'Chayma Yachtov Umlalu Tivu V'Aretz Oreo Ibad V'Shibar B'Richei Amalko V'Soreo V'Goyim Ein Toreh Gam Nevi'eo Lo Yimotzu Chazoyin Mei Adenu Yeshu La'aretz Yitmu Ziknei Basiyoyin He'elu Afar Al Rishon Chagru Sakim V'Yiridu La'aretz Reisho Al B'Suloi Shirushalayim Kol Ma'avad Ma'oi Sinai Hamar Meru Me'ai Nishpach La'aretz Kredi Al Shever Basimi Ba'atei Foinel B'Yoinek B'Choyvois Kiryo Limoy Som Yemru Ei Ayei Dagon V'Yoyin B'Satvom Kechalal B'Choyvoisim B'Hishtapeich Nafshom El Chek Yimoy Som Ma'idei Chuma Damelo Chabash Yerushalayim Ma'yesh Velof Anachameich B'Sulas Basiyoyim Ki Gadol Kayom Shivreich Mi Yirpalach Niviyayich Chazulach Shabbos Afel V'lo yigilu al avoneich Lashiv Shivuseich V'yechazulach Masois Shav U'maduchim Sovku Olayich Kapayim Kol Evrei Derech Sharaku Vayoni Roishom Al Bas Yerushalayim Hazoin Nisai Sheyemru Chilas Yevi Masais L'chalaretz Potzu Alayich Bihem Kol Oivayich Sarku V'yach Karushein Amru Bila'unu Ach Ze Hayom Shekivinu Matzanu Ra'inu Also Adonai Asher Zamo, Mitzayim Rosso Yasher Tzipah Mimei Kedem, Horas Kulei Chamol, Vayisamach Olayich Oyei Beirim Keren Tzoroich, Tzak Libom El Adonai Chaymas Basiyayim, Oyriti Benachal Bimoyim Balayla, Al Titni Pugas Loch Al Titoi Baseneich, Kume Raini Balai, Loroi, Shashmuroi, Shipri Kamayim Nipeich, Noichach, Benyadinoi. See, I love Kapai. Al Nefesh, I love Tufim Barov, Roish Kol Hutois. Re'ei Adinoi V'Habito, Lemi Lalto Koi, Im Teichal no Noshim Periom. Oile leiti puchim im yorek b'mikdash Adonai chayim b'novi shafu la'aretz kutzois nar b'zakein v'sulei sayu v'achrei naflu v'chorev harakta v'yem apecho tabachta v'lei chamalta Tikrach yoim moyet mogurayim misaviv v'loi hayam v'yem ach Adonai palit v'sorim Asher tipachti beribisi oivi chilo. Ani hageber ra'ani b'shevet ebrasa yoisini hanag v'yoilach yishech v'layor ach biyusha v'yafoich yodai kol hayoim bila b'sari v'yoili shibar atzmoisai ono alai v'yakaf roish usala V'machashaki moishavni k'meisei olam godar b'adi v'lo yitzei b'nechashti Gam ki ezak v'ashavai b'goziz nisfoisai Iva daiv oirei fuli ariba mistarim drachai soirer Vayav shecheni samani shoyim dorach kashtoi v'yatziveni kam tara lachet hedi b'chulei sai b'nei yashposoi hayitzi sechoik l'cholam ginosam kalayim Ishbiyani bamrimim hirvani lano v'yagreis b'chotzot shino v'chshati Pishani boifer v'tizenach b'shalom nafshi nasisi toiva v'imar ayva ovad nitzchi v'soichalti meyadin zocharani umerudi la'ana v'roi zachar tizkor v'satzuach alai nafshi zoi zashiv al libi al ken v'yichil chaste adinoi ki lo yisamu ki lo yichol v'rachamom chadoshim lab korim rabal monosechol chel ki adinoi omer nafshi Al kain yichil lo yijay badinoi l'kayvav l'nefesh l'shem toiv yochil v'dumam L'Yeshua Adonai toiv l'kever ki yisol b'nura Yeshei badod v'yitem kinatal olav v'yitem b'yafor piyu Ulai yesh tikva yitem l'makeyu lech yishpa b'cherpa ki lo yiznach Leila Madinai ki maiga v'richam karev chasado Kila yina b'liba milibai v'yageb b'nehishi l'dakei tachas raklav Kol asir v'yoretz l'aktois mishpat kaber Neged p'nei yaldan laveis adam b'riba yadinai loira Mize omar vatei yadinai loitzivom Yal yoyma yisaytzi harais v'atei ma'yisayden adam Choy geber al chata Nach v'sadrach Keinu nach keira v'no shuva adadinai Nisali v'veinu al kapoyim El bashomayim Nachnu poshanu morinu ata Lo yisalach Tozakai sabiyaf tigdefeinu Rachta lo chamal Tozakai sabiyanon Lach mi'avar tefilosophi was Tisimenu v'kerev hamim Patsu aleinu pihem kol Oileinu pachadu V'fachas hayalanu Asais Fashover Palgemoyim Tiradini Al Shebasami Eini Nigra Loisidme Meyen Hafugois Adyashki Bayile Adina Mishamoyim Eini Ololo Lenafshi Kol Benoisiri Tsaduni Kitzipor Oiba Chinam Chamsu Bapor Chayo Vayadu Evendi Chofumayim Aroishi Amartinig Zorti Karasi Shimchadine Mi Bar Sachtiyos Kali Shamoto Al Kale Mostachol Rav Chosi Shabosi Koraftu Biyoy Mekreko Amarto Altiro Rapto Adinoi Vivei Nafshi Kal Tachayo Rais Adinoi Yabososi Shakto Yukoti Rais Adonai Kol Kamai Behekinam Alei Kol Hayai Shifto Mekimosom Abito Ani Manginosom Toshiv Lahom Gu Adinoi Kemaser Yedehem Titen Lahem Gnas Leiv Ta Losecho Lahem Tidoi Piap Hashmitei Mitach Hashemei Adinoi Eichoyuam zo Yishne Akes Matoi Tash Tapaichnov Nekoidesh Perez Kolchutos Benetzion Aykorim Amasuloim Bapos Eichoniach Shabul Nilzei Cheresh Masei Yitzer Gam Tanim Chol Susha Teni Kigrihen Basami Lachzor Kai Midbar Davak Lushayinek El Chikai Batam Oilolim Shalu Lechem Hoydesh Elohem Hoyklim Lemadanim Noshamu Bachutzais Emunim Alei Soilo Chibku Ashpatos Vayital Avoin Basami Mechata Sedoim Hafucha Kamiroga V'lo Yecholu Vo Yodoyim Zaku Nizreo Mishelef Tzachu Mechalovot Muetzem Mitminim Sapir Migzorosam Chashach Mishchar Taram Lo Nikru B'chutzayis Tzafat Oyrom Al Atzrom Yoshei Yovei Shayakaweit Toivim hayu Chalalei cherev mechalalei ra Shehem yoskum dukarim Tinluvai shasadai Yedei nashim rachmani aish bishlo Yadayim hayu Levai v'islamai b'shever pasami Kilo aginoi eschamosai shapach harei Vayatzes eish b'tziyayim v'ateichal Yisoidoi se Eloi heminu malchieres Kol yoshvei sevel ki yavoi tzarvoi B'sharei Yerushalem yechatis v'diyeha Avoinois ki hana shevchim v'kipot dam Tzadikim na'u avirim v'chutzois Negoy aleo badom B'lo yuchlu Yegui belvushehem suru tamei karu lama suru altigo kinatsu gamno omru v'goyim lo yisifu lakur ponai adinoi chukam lo yisif lehabito ponai choyanim lo yinaso uzkainim lo yichononu Oidenu tichlen oinenu el ezrasenu chaver el b'tzipi yosenu tzipinu el goy lo yoshia tzatu tzatenu milaches birchoy v'isenu korav kitzenu malu yomeinu kibo kitzenu kalu ayuro itfeinu nishrei shomayim al yorim dalku b'midbar oravu lan ruach hafeinu Mashiach Adonai yilkad Bishchi soiso Asher amaru v'tziloi nichiyeh v'hagoyim Sisi v'simcha v'azetoi Moshe v'esperetzus Gamolayach tavor koish Tziziku v'sasori Tam avoynech Basiyoi lo yosif L'hadlo yisech Bakad avoynech Basetoi Kilo Al chato yisoyich Zechair Adonai me'oyolonu habitur ei escher pasei nachrosei minech chol azorim boteinu لنخري مسايم هينو بين أبي ما يسألو كالمنايز يا التفرين ندفنو يقعنو بلاينخلانو مترعين مسألو ياد أشور إسبايا الله ما بيسألو خطو بينهم وعناق بيسألو سبالو أبادي ماشربانو بايريكين يادم بنفشينو نبي لخمينو مپני חרב המדבר, אויבינו כסנו נחמרו, מפני זנב ישראל, נשים בציינו, בסלע אספר יהודה, שרים בידם נסלו, פני זקנים נהדרו, ואחרים תכנסו, נדרים בארץ כשלו, זקנים משאר שבסו, ואחרים מנגינסו, שבס מסויס ליבנו, נפח ליבם לחילנו, נפלו התרס רישנו, אויה נלנו כי חטאנו, על זה היה דבר ליבנו, על אלה חשכו עינינו, על הר ציון ששומעים שואלים ופוגעים. אתה עתינוי לעולם תשב כי זכה לדור ודור. למה לנצח תשכחנו תעזבנו לידך ימים השיבנו אדינוי אליך ונשובה חדש ימינו כקדם כי אם מאיס מאסתנו וצפת עלינו עד מוי השיבנו אדינוי אליך ונשובה חדש ימינו כקדם. Okay, so we have a little bit of extra time. We don't want to start the actual, that's the end of the Eicha, the Megillah Eicha. There are 5 Megillot that we traditionally read throughout the year. That's the Megillah of Eicha. We do not want to start before 8 o'clock the actual talk because we believe that several people will join just for the talk. For that reason, I will just give a little bit of a introduction to Tisha B'Av, a few stories and insights until 8 o'clock so that we can start right on time with the 8 o'clock talk on the Crusaders by Mr. Gomer, Rabbi Zach Gomer. That's right, Chair. My assistant for now. And
not going anywhere.
Okay. About 200 years ago, 250 years ago, Napoleon passed by a room, a place, a building on Tisha B'Av, and he heard people crying. And he asked the people that were around him, what's going on? Why are people crying? And he was told that that is a synagogue, that is a shul, and it was Tisha B'Av. It was a day of mourning for the Jewish people. So he said, well, when did this happen? It must have been very recently that people are still mourning something that happened, the way they're mourning. He was told that, no, actually, sorry, 1 second. We'll just put a chair on the table, maybe. Just trying to help for those people that are watching from Facebook. He was told, actually, the Jewish temples were destroyed too close to, at the time, would have been 1700 years earlier. Now it's close to 2000 years. So he said something which is quite a remarkable statement. He said, people that can mourn their losses for 1700 years will surely merit to see their rebuilding. I think that as time moves on, people struggle to connect to the destruction of the temple. And that's understandable. But at the same time, we also have the ability to recognize as time goes on, we're told that we're coming closer to the building of the third temple, to the next era. So while today, yes, we are mourning over the destruction of the temple, the 2 temples, we're also preparing ourselves for that day when we will have the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the complete and utter rebuilding of the third temple. And that's what this is also in merit of. So perhaps you can say, well, it's still a fast day and a sad day, known as the saddest day, but perhaps it's also a glimmer of light. And as we are coming closer to the redemption, we feel less of the pain and more of how that was there to help us rebuild and get somewhere much greater. We know that the Talmud actually says that Mashiach, the Messiah, was born on Tisha B'Av. What doesn't mean that he was actually physically born on Tisha B'Av, or that simply the concept of the Mashiach starts on Tisha B'Av. In order for us to have the Mashiach, we ultimately have to have the destruction of the temple. So I thought I would share with you just a few little episodes and stories that occurred around the time of the temple as we're waiting for the 8 o'clock time, so Mr. Gomo can start his talk. There's one particular story that really, to me, is one of the most important stories historically that we need to know about how did Judaism continue post-temple era. Because we do understand that the temple was not just another thing that Jewish people had. This was the focus of the Jewish people. Every year, Jewish people would travel up to Jerusalem, bring their sacrifices, celebrate over there. That was the center point of Judaism. People almost couldn't imagine a Judaism without a temple. There was one person that was particularly responsible for the future of the Jewish people post-temple era, and his name is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So I just wanted to say the story behind the rebuilding of Judaism post-temple era. The last years of the Second Temple were particularly difficult years in Jerusalem. The Romans had come, they had conquered Israel. There were certain rebellions that came up. It happened over quite a few years, but the Romans had eventually conquered most of Judea at the time. And they had now come to Jerusalem. Jerusalem had a big wall, and most of the wealthiest Jews and Kohanim and the priests, or many people lived in the walled city of Jerusalem, and it was almost unbreachable. And there was two different groups that broke out within the Jewish people. There was those that believed that we should give in to the Romans, stop fighting them. And there was the group that said, no, we have to fight the Romans. We need to have autonomy over the land of Israel. Now, the group that wanted to fight and go to war against the Romans were known as the Bar Yonim. The Talmud doesn't think very highly of them because they caused a lot of havoc and trouble for the people at the time. To understand, the Romans had encircled the entire Jerusalem. People couldn't easily get out, even though the Romans didn't really mind people leaving. However, the Bar Yonim, these extremist people, wouldn't allow people to leave. And they felt that as long as people would remain in Jerusalem, they would feel forced to stay there and fight. The thing was, there was 3 of the wealthiest Jews at the time that actually owned enough produce, flour, water houses, wood, that people could survive for, they said, the Talmud says, close to 20 years. The city of Jerusalem would be able to survive just on those storehouses. Interestingly enough, one of those wealthy people was Kalba Savua, who actually ends up becoming the father-in-law of Rabbi Akiva. These people wanted to make a situation of desperation. They wanted to cause desperation. So what they did is they burnt down all the massive storehouses. And as you can imagine, disaster struck. There was nothing to eat. There was no food. There was no way out. They wouldn't allow people to leave. They wanted everyone to stay in. There was no way out. They were worried that if people left, they would try to make peace with the Romans. And on the other hand, people weren't willing to fight with the Romans. They didn't feel like they had much chance against the Romans. This went on for a while. People really started starving. It was a real problem. People were dying in the streets of starvation. There was no food. There's actually a story the Talmud tells about a woman by the name of Marsa, the wealthiest woman in Jerusalem. Her name was Marsa, and she sent her servants out to buy food. And the servant came back and said, well, the bread that we normally buy, the fine flour bread, is gone. Should I get you the brown bread? And she said, yes, go get the brown bread. And he came back and he said, sorry, the brown bread's gone. There's only black bread. And he comes back and said, well, the black bread's gone. There's only harsh, coarse, old, stale bread. He says, just get me whatever you have. And he comes back and he says, even that is gone. There's absolutely no food left in Jerusalem. And starving, she says, I'm the wealthiest person. I have storehouses of gold. What is gold worth when you can't even buy food? And she took all their gold and poured it into the streets of Jerusalem. And then she walked around searching herself, this wealthy woman, for food. And she found a fig that had been sucked on and dried up. And by tasting it, she was so revolted, never having eaten food like that. And she actually died on the spot as a result. Just to explain, that was the situation, that what was going on at the time in Jerusalem. So Rabbi Yochanan decides that he has to find a way to save the Jewish people. There's absolutely no way that they're going to win the war. Nobody even has strength to fight a war. Nobody has food. And Judaism has to continue. His nephew happened to be the ruler or the head of the Bar Yonim, of these extremists. And he went to his nephew and said, listen, you know the situation. We have no hope. We have to do something to save Judaism. Find me a way out of here. And he said, well, you know that if they find out, I want to help you and I believe you, but all the other soldiers, all the other youngsters have decided that we're going to war and that's it. And there's nothing, I can't convince them. So he said, they came up with a plan where he would fake to be sick and then die. And then eventually he would be carried out. The only thing they did let out of Jerusalem was dead bodies to be buried, because we're not allowed to, till this day, we don't bury dead bodies in the old city of Jerusalem. So he faked dead, and then he was taken out. They actually wanted to stab him, but they said, well, the Romans are going to say that you're stabbing new leaders. So he managed to sneak out, and he comes to Vespasian. When he comes to Vespasian, he calls Vespasian, who was at the time just the general of the Roman army in Judea. He says to Vespasian, he calls him, Your Majesty, the Emperor. And Vespasian said, well, you should deserve the death penalty because you're calling the wrong person the Emperor. At that moment, a messenger came and told him that actually the emperor has just died recently, and Rome has appointed Vespasian to be the new emperor. So he said, well, obviously you have some type of divinic inspiration, prophecy, whatever it is. I see there's something special about you. I would like to grant you 3 wishes. And this is where it becomes somewhat controversial. He requests the family of the leadership that they should be able to leave, so that they should be able to continue, a cure for a particular person that had been fasting for 40 years, and to save the Jewish people by building a new yeshiva, a new house of study to continue Judaism in Yavne. And then the future of the Jewish world becomes Yavne. And from there we know the Talmud was all, or the Mishnah and the Talmud, the great yeshivot of the Mishnaic era, Rabbi Akiva, who was one of his students, and Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Yos, Rabbi Shua, all these people are all there. They leave, Rabbi Yochanan leaves, he does not go back. He goes to Yavne and he sets up a school. And over there, they start to prepare the Jewish people for a post-temple era. And that, to a certain degree, they establish the prayers that we have in a more orderly way. They establish different rituals that would cause us to remember Jerusalem, things in place of the karbanot, the sacrifices, etc. And that's how Judaism has continued and evolved really till this very day, how we have a Judaism that is still existing. to a large degree, thanks to Rabbi Yochanan. If he wouldn't have had that foresight, Judaism would have ended. 5 minutes till we start the talk on the Crusaders and the Jews by Zach Gomo. So I want to just tell you another story that occurred at the same time, but this was after the destruction. Now, after the destruction, the Temple Mount was kind of mowed over, and for many years, Jews barely visited there. Jews were still allowed to live in Jerusalem for the first while until the Bar Kokhba revolt, which happened I think it was 50 years later. The Romans still allowed Jews to live around Jerusalem, but the whole Temple Mount was destroyed. So one time, the great rabbis, including Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Gamliel, and Rabbi Akiva, they went to visit Jerusalem. And they came to what used to be the place of the temple, where they had all been present. They had all been in the temple itself. And when they see the temple totally flat, they see foxes walking out of the place where the Holy of Holies used to be. And the rabbis start to cry. And Rabbi Akiva starts to laugh. Yes, Akiva. You. So Rabbi Akiva starts to laugh famously. And they say, Akiva, Rabbi Akiva, why are you laughing? You should be crying. Isn't this a sad time? The temple that used to stand here is now destroyed. He said, tell me why you're crying. He said, well, obviously we're crying because the temple that was once here where we would bring our sacrifices, we would come to celebrate, we would be joyous together, we would serve God, all the Jews together, has now been destroyed. We have lost the house of God. So Rabbi Akiva said, for that reason I'm rejoicing. Because there was a prophecy that the temple would be destroyed. But there was another prophecy that says that after the temple is destroyed, another temple will come about and be rebuilt. The second temple prophecy about the temple being rebuilt, and boys and girls, men and women, children, and all the Jewish people coming and being joyous together in Jerusalem cannot happen until the destruction. In other words, now that I see that the first prophecy has been revealed, I know that the second prophecy has occurred. I know that the second prophecy will also occur. But the second prophecy about the rebuilding is much greater than what was beforehand. So now I know that if that prophecy came true, the second prophecy will also come true. And we will have the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, and Mashiach will come. It's been quite a long time since then, close to 2,000 years. Yet we're still here, crazy Jews as we are, still commemorating the destruction, with the hope that we're not just celebrating this destruction. We're told that Mashiach is going to transform the day of Tisha B'Av from a day of mourning to a day of celebration, where we will be able to see the beauty in all of the darkness of the exile, all the darkness of our struggles, of the difficulties in our life, and see how they were there ultimately for a higher purpose to help us grow and reveal the true goodness that we have inside. So let us pray and hope that as we finish the Eicha, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva, it says that we will return to God. Let us return and come together back in Jerusalem all together, as has always been prophesied. That's the ultimate purpose and mission of Judaism, that we shall all come together united. So I think we've arrived on time with perfect timing. Now it is 8 o'clock, and as we said earlier, for those that have only joined more recently, we're overjoyed to have you here, even though we shouldn't necessarily be talking like that on Tisha B'Av officially. But this is a joint event with Chabad Dingli. I'm Rabbi Mendel Haller of Chabad Dingli, and Mr. Rabbi Zach Gomo of the head of Jewish Studies at Biala College, a joint event between Biala College and Chabad Dingli. We're grateful that you're all here. You're in for a great treat. We don't give treats on Tisha B'Av, but over here we have exceptions. We're going to hear the story of the Crusades and the Jews by Mr. Zach Gomo, Rabbi Zach Gomo.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Halla, for hosting this joint event with Bialik College and Chabad of Dingley, for Eichar and your insightful words. And I think that it's important to note that a number of people might have initially saw that we were doing a joint event, Chabad of Dingley, Bialik College, something that's never happened in the past, and wondered, Ma Keshe, what's the connection? How did this come to be? And I think it's really, really important to note, now more than ever, that we say that the temple was destroyed because of baseless hatred, because of the divisions, the meaningless but catastrophic divisions that divided the Jewish people at that time and have divided the Jewish people through many times in history. And I think, we've often said in our tradition that if it was the division and the hatred that saw the temple destroyed, it is only the unity and the love that will see the temple rebuilt. And as a Jewish community, we have all different labels, different institutions, different schools, different synagogues, different quote unquote streams of Judaism. But when we boil it all down, aren't these divisions so meaningless, so irrelevant in light of what actually unites us, what unifies us, and what are our combined goals and aims and values and unity that really sits at the heart of what we are and what we should aspire to be? I also, just before I speak about the Crusades, want to note one point, is that there are many traditions for a Saturday night, a regular Saturday night, Motzei Shabbat, not just Tisha B'Av. And one of them is a meal called the Malaveh Malka, the end of Shabbat meal. And there's a tradition, reading in my Siddur tonight, I saw to say in Aramaic at the end of this meal, Dahi Sudata de David Malka Mashiach. This is the feast of David, the anointed king. And obviously it's not a feast day today, it's a sad day, but I hope, as Jews have hoped for 2,000 years, that our saddest day turns into our most joyous. And the only way to get there is together, is to break down those barriers and those divisions. We're one community, despite the labels, now more than ever. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint to share with you all. Give me one moment. Yeah, and if you're watching us on Facebook, you won't see the PowerPoint come up there, and you're more than welcome to keep watching that way. Although if you go in the link immediately below what you're watching now, you will be able to see the PowerPoint as well if you so wish. So let me share my screen, bring up the PowerPoint. And again, we're talking here today about the Crusades and the Jews, what I think is really a fascinating episode in Jewish history. Am I looking good? Can anyone see Mendel's all looking good? You can see the PowerPoint? Fantastic. Okay, so when I start off, I'm going to start off speaking about Europe. And it's hard when we're thinking about history to remember that all of the givens, all of the historical outcomes that we're aware of, the fact that Europe was going to have a renaissance and an industrial revolution, and there were going to be these European empires that spanned the majority of the globe, those things weren't necessarily givens and certainly weren't unforeseen prior to their coming into existence. And Europe, as we see here, this is a map in the 7th century, was at times very much a continent under siege, but certainly Christian Europe was. This was not a center of power. This was not a part of the world that was confident in its future, or that it appeared would be the place where key world events and power would rest. Quite the opposite. And we'll see how we got here precisely. So we spoke about the Roman Empire, the empire that destroyed the Second Temple. Well, the empire that destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE was very much a pagan empire, believing in multiple gods. But by 380 says there AD, but we normally say CE, the Common Era, the Roman Empire had converted to Christianity. Christianity, which had already been tolerated and allowed by Constantine, becomes the religion of the Roman Empire, and it is a Christian empire. But this empire becomes increasingly difficult to govern. We're talking about enormous expanses. We're talking about an empire that stretches linguistically, geographically, culturally, politically, from essentially Scotland in the north to the borders of modern-day Iraq in the east. Think about that as one political moment in the pre-modern era. And so the empire splits into two: a Western empire with its capital in Rome and an Eastern empire with its capital in Constantinople, then Byzantium. And the Western Roman Empire eventually falls. We often have this perspective in history that living standard or quality of life always goes up throughout time. Well, that's very much not the case. We're going to see it here. This incredibly wealthy, sophisticated, powerful Western Roman Empire collapses and enters the dark ages of Europe, where living standards, population, health, learning falls dramatically. And perhaps the one institution that kind of maintains any vestige of power in the former Western Roman Empire is the Catholic Church. This is one of the last vestiges of people that maintain learning, maintain literacy, maintain social institutions, maintain significant international connections. And so Catholicism, which wasn't the only Christian denomination initially in the West, becomes dominant in so much of social and political life. We also have to remember that the last Viking invasion of England, for example, was as late as 1066. Very, very close to the Crusades. We're going to start learning about Viking raids were still a real threat, a real part of life. And this was an incredibly stratified society. Those of you that are familiar with the feudal system, as we call it, this is a society with kings at the top, more or less, I'm simplifying, officials and the church below, knights below that, and the vast majority of people, impoverished peasants at the bottom. And the ruling class, the knightly class, is very much a class obsessed with violence. They gain their power through violence, their legitimacy, and their entire lifestyle is based on violence. Somebody's just, I can hear somebody's door opening and closing, so it's fine with me as long as you're happy for people to hear you there. Someone in the background. But as you can see in this image here, you could see a knight literally splitting open the head of another. And if you look above, there are three noble women kind of swooning over this scene. They're not aghast at it. They're not shocked by it. Violence is something admirable in this world. But again, as I said, this is a world under siege. In particular, as Islam starts to become a force in the Middle East and North Africa, Islam conquers Christian Iberia, what is today Spain and Portugal, or most of it. And in 732, in the Battle of Tours, comes to the gates of Paris itself, which was very close to being conquered by the Islamic world and absorbed into that world. But indeed, we imagine that the Roman Empire just collapsed. One day it was there and one day it wasn't. That wasn't the case at all. It was a slow, gradual decline. And in some ways, it's a strange comparison. But we speak about 2,000 years later, still wanting to see the temple rebuilt. This idea of restoring the Western Roman Empire in Europe doesn't go away. And Charlemagne, or Charles de Grosse, depending on if you're German or French, is an emperor of the Franks, and he establishes what he calls the Holy Roman Emperor, the Carolingian Empire. And it's often joked that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but this was a real attempt to kind of reestablish the Western Roman Empire in Europe, somewhat unsuccessfully ultimately. But people often forget one of the great forgotten kind of empires of history is what we call often the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire. Because remember how we said the Roman Empire split into two? The West falls, the East doesn't. And the Eastern Roman Empire, as the Eastern Roman Empire, lasts longer all the way back from those early centuries until 1453, when it's conquered by the Ottoman Turks, than the rest of the Roman Empire ever lasted. But somehow it's always forgotten. And it's also important to note that they didn't call themselves Byzantines. They called themselves Romans entirely. They viewed themselves as the Roman Empire in its entirety, continuing. And they built incredible structures like the Hagia Sophia that you see here on the outside. Here is the inside. It's obviously, it's been reverted to being a mosque today, but it was built as a Byzantine cathedral. And here's an artist's rendition of what Byzantium looked like. And at the exact time when Western Europe was in the Dark Ages and cities were collapsing and there was no ability to maintain sewerage and disease, the Eastern Empire was at its height, an absolute highlight of the classical Roman and Greek world. Now, as I said earlier, there's a rising power here too, and this is Islam. Islam had spread from its earliest generations with Muhammad and his successors in the Arabian Peninsula to conquer the majority of the Middle East, North Africa, and all the way into Europe incredibly quickly. But after the few generations, the kind of momentum starts to slow as the Islamic world itself becomes divided into competing caliphates or competing dynasties. And these dynasties compete on a range of issues, but significantly on doctrinal religious matters. You have the Sunnis, who follow the sayings of Muhammad, who are generally viewed as the majority kind of orthodoxy, and you have the Shia, who are the followers of Muhammad's family and their descendants. And I'm not going to go into all the nuances, but have a conflicting theological view, and there is a very serious conflict between, for example, the Umayyad Caliphate, which is Sunni, and the Fatimid Caliphate, which is Shia, and others that we will discuss in a moment. And some of these Shia groups in particular become quite eccentric and quite unique in their expression. And I wanted to touch on two very quickly because I think it will be of note and of interest. One of these groups is called the Nizari Ismailis. And like many of these Shia groups, they turn to the mountains bordering what is today Israel, Lebanon, and Syria as kind of hideouts where small number of people persecuted for their religious beliefs can survive against far larger adversaries. Obviously, being in a mountaintop fortress is a good defensive move. And one of the Sunni leaders of the day meets the leader of the Nizari Ismailis, known as the Old Man of the Mountain, and says, "Why don't you just surrender? You and your group come down from the mountain, convert to Sunni Islam. You're vastly outnumbered. You've got no chance. Just surrender. It's the only logical thing to do." And the Old Man of the Mountain says, "You think that we're outnumbered. And it's true you have larger numbers than us, but we have a greater spirit. And I'll show you what I mean." And he calls over one of his young soldiers and says, "Jump off this mountain fortress down to the cliffs to your death." And he does so in an instant. And the Sunni says, "I don't understand. Why would this man do that for no reason? Just give up his life." And what is explained by legend, I have a child here, so I'm conscious that, but what is explained by legend is that this Old Man of the Mountain would train his recruits by bringing them for the very first time into their fortress and giving them copious amounts of narcotics of various kinds, and then taking them into a beautiful garden with all the pleasure and worldly delights one could ever imagine of every single kind. They'd collapse in a drunken stupor, wake up the next morning, and the leader would tell him, "This was a vision of heaven, of the world to come, and if you die in our cause, this is the world you will inherit for all eternity." Now, one of the narcotics that they were said to use was what was known in Arabic as hashish, and they were known as hashishin, which became translated into English as assassins. And these are indeed the assassins of law, who famously were incredible assassins and tempted to kill even Saladin, the Islamic leader, who we'll learn about in a moment. And the second and final of these groups I'd like to mention, which I think will be of interest to people, is that there was a Fatimid, a Shia caliph leader in Cairo named El-Hakim. And most historians and most people in his own time said he was completely mad. he made all kind of laws such as that the night was day and day was night, that it was illegal to be outside during the day and everyone had to be awake and conducting their business at night, all various bizarre laws. He ended up disappearing. Most historians think he was murdered by his sister in the desert, but a small group of his followers believed that he disappeared and that he would return as a messianic figure and lead them on world conquest, starting with conquering China. Very, very strange ideas. They also had to flee Egypt after his disappearance or death, based on what you want to believe, to the mountain ranges of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, where they're known to us today as the Druze. Of course, who are a famous minority in Israel. So there's all these different groups, but nonetheless, this is very much an Islamic golden age. If we look at Western Europe and the quality of life that's there and the academic or scientific rigor, it pales in comparison to what is occurring in the Islamic world at this time, which is very much, at least in the Mediterranean world, the center of gravity, the center of learning, etc. So where are the Jews? I've given a lot of introduction and I haven't spoken about the Jews yet. So let's get into it. So again, we cannot look at history and imagine that everything that we know as to how history turns out was clear to people at that time. The European Jewish world was far smaller and more peripheral to the Mediterranean Jewish world, that's called at the time. It's not quite right to call it the Sephardi world because there are many Jews in what is today Spain and Portugal who after their expulsion will become the Sephardi diaspora. But there is significant Jewish communities developing in Spain and Portugal, in North Africa, in the Byzantine Empire, in the land of Israel, and certainly in what is today Iraq and Persia. Jews that are in Europe, there are some in Charlemagne's empire, but it's small and peripheral. Now, in what is today Iraq, you had a figure known as the Exarch. And I spoke about this in a talk previously, the Resh Galuta in Aramaic. This is a descendant of King David and the Davidic line, who is seen by many Jews and certainly by many non-Jews as kind of the rightful ruler of the Jewish community in exile. And the Byzantine Empire that we spoke about earlier was extremely restrictive on Jews in a whole variety of ways. For example, Jews were not allowed to hold any political office in the land of Israel, where many Jews still were, that the Byzantines controlled, and all kinds of bizarre restrictions. An interesting little side note, in Byzantium, sports teams were very, very popular. And one of the most famous sports or popular sports was chariot racing. And each team was named after a color. And the two most popular colors were the greens and the blues. And I read a book on Byzantine history that noted that most Jews tended to be followers of the blues, even back then, which I think is ironic with the Carlton Blues here today. I'm not a Carlton fan, but I thought that was a little bit of irony. But the Byzantine Empire is not a pleasant place to be Jews, including in the land of Israel that they control. And when the Islamic empires start conquering much of the Byzantine Empire and much of the Mediterranean world, for many Jews, this is very positive. This is by no means a level of equality or tolerance that we might experience in a country like Australia today. But relative to what lay before it, it was an improvement in quality of life. Also, more Jews entered one political regime. So the Abbasid Caliphate, for example, is estimated to have ruled over 90% of the world's Jewish population, which meant 90% of Jews were in the same state under the titular rule of this Exarch, which is actually very positive for Jews in many, many ways. And of course, in what is today Iraq, you have the great Talmudic academies and the Gaonim, their leaders. Rabbi Haller spoke about the Mishnah and its development after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in the land of Israel and the Jerusalem Talmud, with a great center of learners learning and Jewish yeshivot and study increasingly are in Iraq, in Surah and Pumbedita, and this is where the Babylonian Talmud is written, and this is really the great intellectual center of the Jewish world at this time. And of course, often we have this kind of misnomer that after 70 CE and the Roman destruction of the temple, that all Jews are kind of taken into exile, and then like all of a sudden everybody flicks their fingers and it's Fiddler on the Roof for 2,000 years. And that's kind of all of Jewish history. And that's really not the case. Of course, we know Jews were in the land of Israel in significant numbers for much longer. They ultimately write the Mishnah in the Jerusalem Talmud. There is a Bar Kokhba revolt, a second revolt against Rome. But what many people don't remember is that there were over half a dozen revolts. Jews, even after the Bar Kokhba revolt, didn't give up on the idea of retaining political independence in the land of Israel, of rebuilding the temple. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Byzantines and the Byzantine Empire banned Jews from even being in Jerusalem, except for one day a year, Tisha B'Av, what we're commemorating today. And as late as 614, Jews revolt against what they knew as the Byzantine Empire, what we know as the Eastern Empire. Sorry, they knew as the Roman Empire, we knew as the Byzantine Empire. And they really attempt to have a Jewish state established. And they're somewhat successful. They think that the Persians, who are the great enemies of the Byzantines, will in fact invade and assist them. And the Persians end up turning on them and don't do so. But there is a moment of months, according to some years, where there actually was a Jewish state reestablished in the land of Israel. But let's turn back now to medieval Catholic Europe. Many of us, when we think about the Jewish experience in medieval Europe, think about blood libels against images such as we see here, demonizing Jews, of Jews having to wear distinctive clothing such as pointed hats and yellow badges, of living in ghettos. All those things are true, but they all come after the First Crusade, not before. And I'll explain how and why. So the First Crusade is called by Pope Urban II in the 12th century. And there's a number of conflicting accounts as to what this crusade was, what the reason behind this crusade was. And I'm not going to read through everything. I've written one here. I'm not going to read through it. I'm not going to go through all of the intricacies, but suffice to say, all of the beliefs share a combination of something relating to a desire to reconquer the land of Israel from Muslim rule, because of course it was in Christian hands prior to that, even though it was a number of centuries earlier, allowing Christian pilgrims to enter the land of Israel, a quest for land for some that would go there, even though that's debated because the cost associated seems to negate that. But certainly, Pope Urban II creates an idea that had not existed beforehand. Remember that Christianity is actually quite a pacifist religion in theory and textual base. The idea that killing a non-Christian could lead to the remission of sin. That if one killed somebody in the name of God or in the Crusades, that could actually absolve one of sin they had committed beforehand. This idea didn't exist yet. All the accounts say that after this proclamation, the crowd yells out, Deus vult, God wills it, and the crusade begins. But there were a number of first crusades. It would be a mistake to imagine that everybody went off together, because they did not. You really had two main early crusading forces. One is the knights, the aristocrats, who the Pope was really speaking to. These are the warriors, these people who live by the sword, and the Pope's hope is that they will go and undertake this crusade. And many of them do sign up to go on this crusade, but these people are familiar with warfare, and they know warfare takes time. They need to, many of them, mortgage their property and their land to be able to afford to outfit this incredibly expensive army and journey and get their affairs in order. But there are a number of people who the Pope didn't expect would go on crusade and didn't really want to, who end up doing so. And these are the peasants. For them, the idea of leaving, the 5 square kilometers where they'd spend their entire life in a village in essentially slavery, and going off to the Holy Land on this incredible, exciting, romantic journey and a free ticket to heaven if they kill people, sounds really, really appealing. And there is a gentleman named Peter the Hermit who basically leads these people on a crusade, and they start going by on foot. And people aren't very happy about this, because as they travel in this great multitude, they often have to eat everything in their path in order to survive, which is the produce of others. And they start to realize that walking from France to Jerusalem takes a while. It's not a very simple, quick, easy process. And as they're going and advancing, they start to get bored and they start to get agitated, and they start to get angry. And they start to notice that there aren't large numbers of Jews living in Western Europe at the time, but there are some, particularly in the key urban centers. And they start to say to themselves, why go all the way to Jerusalem to kill the infidel when we have infidels right here? And they undertake horrific massacres of Jews. But it's important to note that whilst this will change later, at this stage, the establishment, the papacy, the Pope and the church and the aristocrats aren't actually on board with this, and sometimes even make efforts to save Jews, other times don't, because their ideology can be very much summed up in this famous series of carvings in Europe, Catholic Europe, known as Ecclesiasta and Synagoga. And you could see here two images, two women. The women on the left, these are just two repeats, two versions of this, is Ecclesiasta, the church. This is a woman holding a cross, holding a chalice, upright, proud. And on the right, you have Synagoga, the synagogue, the Jew. Her staff is broken, she is blindfolded, the tablets of the law are laid down, and the Jews fulfill a function in Catholic ideology of the time for which the popes want them alive. They want Jews to be amongst Christians in a state of subjugation, in a state of persecution, in a state of destitution, so that they can constantly point to the Jew and say, you see, this is what happens for those that reject our true religion, our true God. And actually, they don't want them dead, they want them as their scapegoats. But that will change over time. And ultimately, Peter the Hermit and his gangs arrive at Constantinople. And sorry, something that I forgot to mention is one of the key justifications for the crusade is that the Roman emperor in Constantinople, Alexis, sends a request to the Pope for help because he's afraid that he's going to be conquered by the Muslims. He sends a request for help. And so in many ways, the Crusades are there to save the Byzantine Empire. And they arrive in Constantinople and everybody's shocked. The Byzantines, who are living at the height of the Roman world, see these peasants turn up and smell them probably from much further and say to themselves, these are the people that are going to save us. This is we don't want them here. And the peasants see this city that is something of a size, scale, wealth, sophistication, cleanliness that they can't even conceive of and imagine. And they say, we're coming to help them? This is inconceivable. And actually, they're not even allowed into the gates of the city. They're very quickly sent away, where they are basically, as soon as they enter Muslim lands, captured, sold into slavery, and never heard from again. However, there is the official crusade, the crusade of the nobles, the knights, the aristocrats, and they travel, some of them by land, but the majority by sea. Far wiser method a more efficient method of transportation. And they, in 1099, actually conquer Jerusalem very, very swiftly and very convincingly, and incredibly bloodily. Now, it's important to note that there are Jews, of course, in the land of Israel at this time, and many of them fight with the Muslims against the Christian Crusaders. Particularly in Haifa, the Jews kind of led the defense of the city, and with justification, because the Crusaders were incredibly brutal to Muslims and to Jews as well, and to, unfortunately, many of the Eastern Orthodox Christians that are in the land of Israel as well. Here's a few quotes speaking about, from Crusaders' own accounts, what they did. Men were killing and slaying even to the Temple of Solomon. They were so ignorant of where they were going, they actually thought that the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque was still the Temple of Solomon, standing on the Temple Mount, where the slaughter was so great that our men waded in blood up to their ankles. According to Raymond of Aguilera, in the Temple and Porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. Fulcra of Charters, in this temple, 10,000 were killed. Indeed, if you had been there, you would have seen our feet coloured to our ankles with the blood of the slain. But what more shall relate? None of them were left alive. Neither women nor children were spared. Many of the Jews in the city of Jerusalem are routed into it, which only the Muslims allowed them to re-enter, into the synagogue, where it was burnt on their heads. incredibly bloody. But how did the Crusaders do it? How did they conquer this so quickly? Well, one of the advantages they had was that the Islamic world was divided into these different kingdoms and sects that we spoke about earlier. Another advantage that they had, there's a great, he's not really a historian, amateur historian named Dan Carlin. And he said something that I found quite entertaining. He said that in the West, the method of warfare has always been like the boxer Mike Tyson. What was Mike Tyson's advantage? The boxer, he was just the strongest guy. He was always the strongest guy in the ring, and he went for the knockout punch. Whereas the East always fights like Muhammad Ali. What was the advantage of Muhammad Ali? It wasn't necessarily strength. It was speed and intelligence. He would use the strength of his enemy against them. And initially, the great strength, particularly of the heavy cavalry of the Europeans, is able to defeat the light cavalry of the Islamic forces, but we'll see that this will change. And a problem the Crusaders consistently have is they never have a large number of Catholic Europeans who will come and help establish these Crusader states. And so they do a number of things to compensate for that. One is the building of castles. This is Crac de Chevalier, one of the biggest in modern-day Syria, still being used today as a military installation in the Syrian civil war. And this was how these aristocrats and knights controlled Europe as well, that you have large fortifications on mountaintops that control vast areas of the countryside. The very relatively small numbers of knights can be in on cavalry and sweep out when necessary to control the population. They also have a series of monastic orders such as the Templars, again, the Temple, Solomon, who help defend this here. And this is all kind of good and well until we have the figure of Saladin. Now, it's interesting, Saladin was actually not an Arab. That's a misnomer, and we'll see how that becomes significant later. He was actually a Kurd from what is today northern Iraq, and he manages to unite much of the Islamic world and overcome the Crusader fortresses as a result. And when we spoke about those different kind of methods of combat and using an enemy's strength against them, one of the key battles that was very decisive was the Battle of the Horns of Hattin. This is in northern Israel today. You can still, see the site. And here, Saladin prompted the Crusaders' army to meet him up in the Galil in the middle of summer, in their heavy armor, their heavy metal in the middle of summer, and positioned himself between the Crusader forces and the only sources of water. Set fire to the grass so it was filled with smoke and heat, and the Crusaders basically collapsed from heat stroke before the battle even begun, and such was their military destroyed, and Jerusalem ultimately reconquered by Saladin and the Islamic forces. There was a third crusade where Richard Plantagenet went to help try to reconquer Jerusalem, but he was unsuccessful. It's very ironic, actually, that Richard Plantagenet is known to history as Richard the Lionheart of England. This was a man who was actually Norman from what is today France, who Normandy controlled England as well. England was kind of the backwater of his empire. They had very little interest in, very rarely visited, didn't really speak English. Was a pretty horrible, violent, brutal person, fought his own father and others, bankrupted England in ransoming him from his unsuccessful campaigns. But for some reason, they call him the Lionheart and put his statue in front of their parliament. Very, very odd, but each to their own. And there were many other series of crusades. There was even one called the Children's Crusade, where many of the crusades were unsuccessful. The Pope said, well, obviously God isn't hearing our prayers, and it's because of our sins that we're not succeeding. So they took a group of children and said, these children are innocent. If they go, the gates of Jerusalem will open, and send them out. They were immediately taken by the Muslim forces and sold into slavery and never heard from again. This seems to be a repeated story. And on one of the crusades, the Crusaders sacked and destroyed the city of Constantinople itself that they initially had started the crusade to defend. This is a complete bloody mess. In 1291, Akka, the last Crusader foothold in the land of Israel, is conquered, and the Crusades in the land of Israel are over. And very much Europe seems to be an empire on retreat. But you ask the question of who conquered who. Ultimately, the Crusades were unsuccessful. And in many ways, the Islamic or Arabic world conquered the European world, at least culturally, philosophically, technologically, because it is in the Islamic world that the Europeans re-encounter or relearn so much of the mathematics and science that had existed in the Roman world but had been lost, then the Islamic world had still continued and was flourishing. And numerous words such as algebra, alchemy, even alcohol, re-enter European languages from the Islamic world. And what we call today Arabic, although they're originally Indian numerals, replaced Roman numerals, which is very, very significant. Now, the Crusades were seen as positive in Europe up until very, very recently. Today, the Crusades, justifiably, correctly, I would say, have a bad rap as a ruthless, bloody series of events. But as recently as George Bush, he called the war on terrorism a crusade. And as we said, the symbol of Richard the Lionheart was the symbol of the resistance of London against the Blitz in World War II. And even Osama bin Laden, in justifying the 9/11 attacks, used the word crusade to reflect the Europeans in a negative sense. But it's interesting, the Crusades were often forgotten in the Islamic world until very, very recently, only because of a very strange little nuance. As many of you know, in World War I, the Ottoman Empire and the German Empire were allies, Gallipoli and whatnot. And Kaiser Wilhelm II, before World War I, visited the Ottoman Empire. And when in Ottoman Syria, he saw the grave of Saladin. He learned about Saladin and the Crusades and respected Saladin, even though he was on the opposing side, and laid a wreath at Saladin's tomb and built a second tomb for Saladin for some reason, as you can see here. Now, many Arabs who were citizens of the Ottoman Empire but wanted to revolt against it and adopted an Arab identity said, well, if this guy Saladin, who we'd kind of forgotten and never heard of, is so respected by the Emperor of Germany, he's obviously a really great Arab who united the Arab world, conquered Jerusalem, let's make him our hero. Now, they kind of forgot that he wasn't an Arab, he was a Kurd, but till today, many Arab states have the eagle of Saladin as the emblem of their country, their state seal, and there are statues of him in Cairo, Damascus, and others. Now let's go back to the Jews. So really, when the Crusades are unsuccessful in the land of Israel, Europe turns in on itself. And there is a lot of anger and resentment against their inability to defeat the Muslims, and they start looking at defeating, quote unquote, the enemy within, the Jews. And many of the most restrictive anti-Semitic messages that we're familiar with, the measures of Jews wearing distinctive clothing such as the pointed hats and gold star, living in deserts, in ghettos, the blood libels, all of these accusations against Jews, incredible restrictions, are post-Crusades phenomenon. In many ways, it's kind of the tantrum of the spoiled child that doesn't get what they want. And ultimately, Jews are expelled from much of Western Europe after the Crusades, from England, from France, from much of what will become Germany. And the Europeans look for other places to conquer. The Crusades don't end. They end in the land of Israel. But even as late as the conquest of the Americas by Spain were labeled in crusading terms. And indeed, Europeans conquer Spain and Portugal back from the Muslims. And the golden age of Jews in Spain ends as a result of this extension of the Crusades. And as many of us know, the expulsion from Spain in 1492 of Jews is perhaps the most infamous and significant of expulsions. And this changes the entire trajectory of Jewish history. Because Jews who'd been predominantly a Mediterranean people, many in the land of Israel, many in Iraq as well, are expelled from the places they are in Europe, the great center in Spain in particular, and start to travel to new places. At the same time, the Talmudic academies of Gaonim of Iraq start to decline because of increasing restrictions by Muslim empires that become less and less tolerant over time, and ultimately by the conquest of the Mongols that really destroys this part of the world. And we know a lot about Jewish history at this time because of a gentleman named Benjamin of Tudela, who was a Spanish Jew who's traveled throughout the Jewish world and gave very detailed accounts. But in particular, Jews that are being expelled from Western Europe are looking for a new place to settle in a hostile world, and there is a new rising empire in the East. Now, you'll see a map here, and you might say to yourself, what is this country? This is not a country I'm familiar with, spanning most of today's Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and the Balkans. This is the new empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This is an empire that didn't have many Jews at the time. There were not really Jews in Eastern Europe at all, only small numbers on the Black Sea. But they allow Jews to enter. And they allow Jews to develop a sort of status as middle class, middlemen. And this is a painting from a whole series of art, Polish art, showing kind of the welcoming of Jewish refugees, of which the Poles were quite proud at this time. It's important to note the Ottoman Empire also accepts a lot of Jewish refugees as well. And here, the great experience of Eastern European Jewry develops. And all of the Jewish communities of what will in time become Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic, Lithuania, Poland, all start from this refugee experience in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And ultimately, as a result of a whole series of historical phenomenon, this becomes the great demographic and in many ways cultural, intellectual center of the Jewish world of the next few centuries. And it's important to note that in Hebrew, Poland is called Polin. And this is actually a word that has very little to do with the Polish word for Poland, which is Polska. And when I was in Yad Vashem, I did a course there. They said that there's a distinction one could often find in Polish Jews between those who left Poland prior to the Holocaust and those who left after. Those who left after the Holocaust often refer to as Polania, which literally just means the land of Poland. It's a far less emotive term. Whereas those who left before, and Jews for many centuries prior, referred to it to Polin, which the etymology has often been understood to mean Polin, here we will lie, here we will dwell, here we will settle, here we are safe from those persecutions we experienced otherwise. We obviously know how this ends in great tragedy, but that's interesting to note, and how the Crusades, as an influence on Jewish history, led to this outcome. And again, I said Fiddler on the Roof, so I'll come back to Fiddler on the Roof as a tevia that in many ways it is because of the Crusades and the subsequent experience of Jewish history that this vision of a Jew, this vision of the Jewish world comes into existence. I've been far faster than I normally am. I've kind of come to the end of my slides here, but I am very, very keen and willing to take any questions that anybody might have. So any questions, anybody? Oh, I see in the chat, is there a question here? Sorry, I didn't see that until now. Good evening. Good evening to you too. All right. Is there any questions from anybody at all? So it's a lot of information that I've kind of shared there. And again, I think it's important to note that you might ask, what do the Crusades have to do with Tisha B'Av? Well, I hope you both thought, how it relates to the Jewish experience in the land of Israel and the relationship with the temples that keeps kind of recurring. But also, we have a tradition on Tisha B'Av to commemorate all of the tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people throughout Jewish history. And, this was a tragedy of huge proportions in so many ways. Are there any questions? Here from Joe. Did the Polish Jews originate from Spanish Jewish refugees? That's a fantastic question, Joe. And it's something that's often suggested anecdotally by many. And my understanding is not to a significant extent. Were there sub-Jews who left Spain and Portugal and ended up in Poland and Eastern Europe? Yes, there definitely were. There definitely were. But the vast bulk of Jews in Eastern Europe came from those expelled from France, Germany, England, the Rhineland, and others. And a question that one should ask, and is quite obvious, is how did what was one of the smallest populations in the Jewish world end up being so large? And that, again, is a relatively recent phenomenon. And there's a few reasons for that. One is Catherine the Great, the Russian empress, who conquered much of what is today Poland, and that kind of whole Jewish expanse, or the Russian Empire did, rather, had a huge public program of vaccines, which is obviously quite topical, particularly as related to smallpox and others. And this saw a population explosion in life expectancy in Eastern Europe in general, including the Jews that were there. So it wasn't so much that Jews exploded in number, whereas Eastern European numbers exploded as well. And secondly, there was a very unique family structure that developed from Jews in Eastern Europe in those later centuries, whereby couples would marry very, very young, as young teenagers quite often, and then would spend a decade or more of their early married life in the home of the wife's family. And what that would do is that would give a kind of financial and material security to those Jews who would in turn then have children very, very young, more of whom would survive childhood and live to adulthood because resources were pooled. And in an age where life expectancy and survival rates for children, often 1 out of 2, this became a foundation for significant population growth. Okay, I think we might have some more questions. Who painted the painting Pauline? Just showed a few minutes ago. I don't remember who it was, but there's a whole series of Polish art. There was a whole kind of period in Poland where Polish painters, Catholic Polish painters, would paint this because it was seen as a glorious thing in Polish history, that they welcomed the Jews. They were very proud of it at certain times in their history. Did the death of Rashi coincide with... So interesting that you would say that. Yes, Rashi in the First Crusade. And there's a whole phenomenon, I don't know how far I can go into it, of Rashi and his kind of successors, the Tosfot, how the Rashi's kind of formative years were prior to the First Crusade, whereas the Tosfot's formative years were post it, and how their work is a lot kind of darker and has a kind of grayer view of the world because of this tragedy they experienced, whereas Rashi lives in a more pleasant era. The expulsion is, of course, the origin of Yiddish from medieval German, absolutely. And of course, Ashkenaz means German in medieval Hebrew, because that was the center. It wasn't Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, it was Germany. When did Ashkenaz Jews start dressing in the black hat look and why? Okay, amazing question. Okay, so I love this, all right? I'm going to tell you this. Okay, so in Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was not majority Polish ethnically. You had a very small number of Polish aristocrats who kind of had absolute rule over this larger population of peasants, essentially, of different ethnicities and religions, Slavs, Ukrainians, Orthodox, Catholic, and other. And they became so distinct from the majority of the population they controlled that they actually developed a completely fictitious, completely fanciful myth that the Polish aristocracy wasn't Slavic, wasn't even European, that they were the descendants of Persian invaders into Europe. They made it up. It was completely fictitious. And they started to imagine for themselves what Persians dressed like. And they imagined silk kaftans and fur hats and everything that we associate with Hasidic Jewish dress today in many ways. And they started to dress like this. It was a complete fabrication. And this became the high fashion of the day. And so Jews, as well as others, would dress this way when they wanted to wear respectable clothing. And the Polish aristocrats eventually moved on, and Jews maintained it. Now, it's interesting to note that today we see Hasidic Jews often dressing that way, whereas we have non-Hasidic, even ultra-Orthodox Jews dressing differently. They all started dressing that way. The Hasidim didn't start dressing that way. They just continued to do so. There were others that dressed in a more modern fashion. And in particular, the Russian Empire banned that kind of dress, which is why you'll see that often Jews from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example, will wear kind of an older looking dress, whereas Jews who were in the Russian Empire wear a more modern one. And when I say more modern, still often long silk black coats, but for example, black was adopted over other colors. The spodek that some Hasidim wear was actually a legal implication by the Russians because it was more of a Russian style hat than the Polish style hat. So yeah, that's I hope that's. But what I find so funny about that is often today you'll see in Israel, walking down the streets of Bnei Brak in the middle of summer, and you'll see it Shabbat, and you'll see a Hasidic man wearing a fur hat and a silk kaftan down to his knees, and people will say, "Look at these crazy people dressing like it's Siberia in the middle of the Middle Eastern summer." And I get it, it'll be hot, but at the same time, it's ironic to think they're actually wearing what people in Europe imagine people in the Middle East wore. So I think that's kind of funny how these things come around in circles. Okay, let's see here. The expulsion, German, Ashkenazi dressing. How different do you think Jewish history would have been if the Crusades succeeded in the way they wanted to? You said essentially they failed, so what would have been different? Very hard to, it's a fool's game predicting historical outcomes. But I think if they succeeded, good and bad, maybe then it would have been better for Jews in Europe because they wouldn't have expelled, but certainly any Jews under the Crusaders' rule, and if that expanded, would have been horrifically persecuted as they were during the Crusades themselves. It wasn't a good thing any way you look at it. With the Crusaders, is there a number given for the amount of Jews in Ashkenazi Europe at the time of the First Crusade? I think it would be hard to give an exact number. I think we're speaking, somebody will turn around and say, no, I have a source that proves you wrong. I'm saying tens of thousands, I think we're speaking about. Maybe 100,000. It's not enormous numbers. With the Crusades seeking to fulfill the prophecy of the Book of Revelations by restoring Christian rule in Jerusalem, I imagine so to a certain extent. I'm not an expert on Christian theology, but I imagine so to a certain extent. What caused Muslims to turn against the Jews? Well, it depends on when you're asking that, because on one level, Islam turns against the Jews in the very beginning. Muhammad was very, very clear. He imagined that Jews would follow him from the very, very start. As many people know, Muslims themselves will not dispute this. The original holy site for Muslims was Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. They prayed facing Jerusalem originally, and only after the Jews rejected Muhammad did they turn to Mecca. There were a number of Jewish tribes in Arabia when Muhammad announced it, and he thought they would convert, and when they didn't, had very bloody conquests against them. Khaybar is one of the most famous examples till today. A rallying call of many Muslims, anti-Semitic Muslims, is Khaybar al-Yahud. Remember Khaybar, you Jews, because that was a Jewish town in Arabia that Muhammad wiped out. He actually spared one Jewish girl from Khaybar who he married. One of Muhammad's wives was actually a Jewish woman, and she was teased for being Jewish by his other wives. You can look into this. This is known in Islamic history. So when did Islam turn against the Jews? Depends on what you mean. But certainly there is a Jewish historian named, the name eludes me at the moment. I'm sorry, if I remember, I'll come back to him. But wrote a lot about Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis wrote a lot about the Middle East, and he said that life for Jews in the Islamic world was never as bad as Christendom at its worst. There was never an Auschwitz in the Islamic world, but it was never as good as Christendom at its best. There was never an Australia in the Islamic world, right? So whilst the Islamic world, certainly, for much of Islamic history, Jews had a dhimmi status, but they had to pay additional tax, couldn't build a house larger than a Muslim, couldn't ride a horse, couldn't carry a weapon, which were all signs of, status, had all kinds of restrictions. It was never the horrific genocidal experience of the Christians for the most part. And even, in the medieval era, even in the era of Crusades, Saladin, his personal physician was Maimonides, Rambam. It's hard to imagine in the same age a Christian leader having a Jewish physician, let alone letting a Jew study medicine. So often we speak about the golden age of Jews in Spain and how tolerant the Islamic world was. Yes, it was tolerant in comparison to to Christian Europe at that time, but it was not anything we would term as tolerant compared to our understanding today. And maybe you can't judge people in the past based on the standards of today, but it's important to note. Not a question, but thank you for your presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Julian McGiggles. Oh, okay. That's a student of mine. Okay. Thank you, Julian, very, very much. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in RNS too. Did the Jews stay separate from the rest of the population? Sylvia asked. I asked, did you mean in the Islamic world or the Christian world? I'm not sure. Definitely Jews were more integrated in the Islamic world than the Christian. There was still a level of separateness, but that real separation, that ghettoization, is a Christian phenomenon post-Crusades. The Jews in Poland were well organized, the community of four lands, were autonomous. Absolutely, Sonia. Yeah, Jewish life was really took on a level of internal independence in the Polish Empire prior to the Bogdan Khmelnytsky massacres. Absolutely. And in Ripollet as well, perhaps. And in Digley Village as well. No. Why did they expel the Jews? Was it because of their religion and culture, or was it because they were so steadfast in their belief? And yeah, it was, there was the external crusade to kind of purify the Holy Land from Muslims. When that failed, there was an internal crusade to purify Europe from non-Christians, whatever that looked like. And if that was Jews, then we could expel them. And if we can get their wealth or get the debts that we owe them disappear because they're expelled, all the better. That was often also a significant motivator. I recommend the article by Doron Peretz, Mizrahi Magazine, currently available, explaining 3 different sources of anti-Semitism, according to the Vilna Gaon. Fantastic. I'd love to look that up. Dustin Feldman, another outstanding Bialik student, until the point when the Jewish people started wearing the Persian gear and then continually wearing that, with the Jewish population tend to wear the modern clothes of the day. Hard to say exclusively. There's definitely a Jewish understanding. It's often said that the Jews in Egypt kept a small number of distinctions, one of which was clothing, and the idea of dressing differently from the non-Jewish population does have sources and significance throughout Jewish history. So it's hard to say, it's hard to make that point. Certainly Jews, for example, in Yemen, which is one of the oldest and most traditional Jewish communities that was existent even in First Temple times, wore distinctive clothing all the way to the modern era. Still, what you might identify as Yemenite clothing, but distinctive from non-Jews. Queen Elizabeth I had a Jewish physician at one stage. Amazing. Much later, still significant for a few centuries, but there you go. Queen Elizabeth I had a Jewish physician. I did not know that. Interestingly, one thing that I do think is fascinating is that there is a concept known as British Israelism, which I don't know if many of you are familiar with, which is the idea that the royal family of England are actually descendants of the Davidic line, blood descendants of the Davidic line, which again is a similar phenomenon to what we spoke about earlier in the Polish leaders, the idea like we couldn't be of the same stock of the people we rule, we must be of different descent, this time of Jewish descent. It's obviously, it's quite interesting. So yeah, the Ger Hasidim. I'm not sure if that's a question. A noted Pope Urban was pivotal in the Crusades, adopting killing of the Jews. Jesus, Garber's copy of the army. Oh, you say, okay, the Ger Hasidim, yes. Ger Hasidim, for example, with the spodek, the tall hat, and their coats, we might look at it today as traditional Hasidic garb. That was not traditional Hasidic garb. That was enforced by the Russian military as well. Yeah, there were a few options. So I think we might be running out of time, but I want to thank everybody so much. I hope that was felt like it was a useful experience for people on this very, very significant night. And I might turn to Rabbi Haller to end us off.
Yeah, just to end that, so Zach is thanking from Bialik, from Chabad Dingley. I want to say a big thank you to Zach. And we are very privileged to have you part of our community. And thanks to bringing the Bialik community to join us tonight for this brilliant talk, absolutely brilliant. And we learned the importance of Jewish history. Jewish history is something if we want to know why we're here and where we're going, we have to know what we've been through and how we've survived all of that. And once we have that understanding, we'll know where Judaism is going. So hopefully this is just another one of many, many more great talks from Rabbi Mr. Zach Omo. I like to call him Rabbi because he has smicha, but Mr. is what he's called in school. So whatever you know, thank you so much for joining us. On Tisha B'Av, we don't necessarily Laila Tov, but for those that are fasting, have a good and easy fast. And please God, it should be in Jerusalem. Have a good night.